Alan holds a master's degree in library and information science from the University of Rhode Island and a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from Keene State College. As part of his work at the Society, Alan regularly lectures and has presented more than 1,000 public programs. His lively and informative column appears weekly in the Keene Sentinel. I know many of you enjoy that column. In addition, he has published 9 books on local art and history. He has served as president of the New Hampshire Archives Group and as an officer of other statewide professional history organizations. He is passionate about sharing stories through his writing and presentations. We're honored to have Alan Rummerill as our speaker this evening.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, indeed, more than 1,000 presentations, which means I've been doing this for a long time. As of May 1st, it's now 39 years at the Historical Society. Tonight, as you know, my topic is the artists who have painted Mount Monadnock. And as was mentioned, for almost 200 years, artists have focused on the landscape of the mountain as the subject of their canvases. So this has been an inspiration for their art, a muse of sorts, as I have said. For some, it was a single painting. For some, it was one of many subjects they worked on and did several mountain paintings. And for a couple of artists, it was really the main focus of their entire career. Is this turned on? We have it. So we'll review the many painters and the history of their lives and their work in the region, and we'll investigate, as you've heard, what their work tells us about the mountain, about the region, and about the artists themselves. We'll also look at how their work illustrates the American view of nature and how that view was, in turn, influenced by the art that they were doing. I'll discuss the different styles of painting employed by these people, and finally we'll take a look at the impact of these landscapists on tourism and the early people who came to visit the mountain and land conservation on the mountain as well. We have to begin with the mountain itself. An important element of this story is the public view of our national natural landmark. Before artists began to paint here in about the 1840s. The first European settlers here in the 1700s viewed the mountain as wasteland. And those are their words, because these people were farmers and they could not farm up high on the slopes of the mountain. However, the advent of free time and disposable income allowed more people to get out and enjoy nature. Some enterprising individuals were attempting to sell refreshments and encourage people to climb the mountain as early as the 1820s and 1830s. Naturalists such as Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson visited the mountain and wrote about its virtues, thereby attracting the attention of readers across New England. So the opinion of the mountain was beginning to change by the time the artists arrived here. It was no longer viewed simply as wasteland by the farmers. To get the full picture of the interaction between art and nature, we have to step back prior to the arrival of artists at Monadnock. Artists arrived here a couple of decades after they began painting in the White Mountains. Here's a White Mountain view. And these views were more dramatic and impressive than Monadnock. The first painters there depicted the mountain as dark and foreboding in a style known as the Gothic style. This wilderness inspired fear, anxiety, and stress to those people who were trying to travel through the White Mountains. They suggested that fragile man had limited power over nature, and the power of nature was greater than the power of man. Despite that, the nature created by God was beautiful, as indicated by this artist. Author Robert McGrath has described this feeling as pleasurable terror. To the south in Cheshire County, the area had been settled by white men earlier, and the landscape was less daunting and formidable, so there was little Gothic art depicting our mountain. The first three artists whose images of Monadnock were published are not known to us today as professionals in the field of art. One was a geologist, one a scientist and inventor, and one a teacher of penmanship. Charles T. Jackson, shown here, was born at Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1805. He was a graduate of Harvard Medical School and a brother-in-law of Ralph Waldo Emerson, which may explain some of his interest in the mountain. Emerson was one of the prominent authors closely associated with the mountain, having visited and written about it, most notably in his 400-line poem entitled Monadnock. While at Harvard, Charles Jackson made a geological exploration of Nova Scotia and became very interested in the field of geology. In 1829, he traveled to York, where he studied both medicine and geology for several years. When he returned to the United States, he served between 1836 and 1844 as the state geologist of Maine, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire successively. It was in his role as geologist for New Hampshire that he plays into our story. His book, entitled Final Report on Geology and Mineralogy of the State of New Hampshire, was published in 1844. This was a landmark work on the geology of New Hampshire, but it also contained the first published artwork of Mount Monadnock that we know of. This is it. It was rendered by Jackson himself. He soon left the state and accomplished important work in the field of geology, but it is for this book that he's best remembered in New Hampshire and for that image that he's best known in the Monadnock region. This drawing of Monadnock and Dublin Lake was published on the 1858 Cheshire County wall map. The image was based on a drawing by Dublin native Charles K. Mason, a penmanship teacher and a bookkeeper. He made the slope and crags of the mountain appear more dramatic than they really are. Amos Emerson Dolbear's painting was published a couple of years later. He was a native of Norwich, Connecticut, was orphaned at the age of 4, and then came out to live with the family in Roxbury, New Hampshire. Dolbear attended the one-room school in Roxbury and was noted as a quiet and studious teacher. In the 1860s, he became interested in lithography. That's when he created the print of his original work, Monadnock from Stone Pond. This is the print. In 1874, he took a job as a professor of physics at Tufts University. He's best remembered today as an inventor, not as an artist. Many of his inventions were patented, among them the electric telephone, writing telegraph, static telephone, airspace telegraph cable, and the wireless telegraph, and he indicated that he invented the telephone 11 years before Alexander Graham Bell. He could not prove that in court, and the Supreme Court refused to recognize it. Despite his success in the scientific community, he always retained his interest in his childhood home and continued to visit Roxbury until his death. So these three images can tell us a bit about the state of art and the view of nature at the time the works were created. We've moved past the dark Gothic style to a more romantic feeling, and indeed the style is known as Romanticism. Here we see man and nature contrasting. Yet in harmony, man has begun to live near the mountain and to create a life in the wilderness, but the mountain still stands tall and alone, separate from man. So the wild prospect of the mountain combines domestic scenes of farms, farmers, and in this case, village dwellers. Mason's piece shows man really at complete peace with nature, boating, strolling, and taking carriage rides near the base of the mountain. All coexisting together, man and nature. Dolbear's Mount Monadnock from Stone Pond, in this we see the mountain itself being domesticated as farmers are trying to clear further and further up the slopes. And people are enjoying leisure time here, as we see from the people boating on the pond itself. So farmers, tourists, and the mountain are all interacting and coexisting. Some of the early White Mountain artists also made their way south to paint Monadnock. Two of the most prominent of those were John White, Alan Scott, and Alvin Fisher. They were clearly much better known than the three we've just talked about. Scott was the first professional artist that we know of to work on the mountain. He was born outside of Boston in 1815. In addition to painting, he was also a lithographer and an engraver. He's best known for his paintings in the White Mountains and the Catskills, but he did several monadnocks as well. Here in this work, we see some elements similar to Dolbear, Mason, and Jackson. So the mountain standing alone, separate from man. And we see the impact of winter on mankind as well. They can't control it, but man has managed to settle and survive here, even in the coldest winter months. This view from the northeast is quite small, about 10 by 14, but the detail is amazing, down to the pitchforks. This isn't the clearest image, but you can actually, on the original, see the pitchforks of the men who are working there and the spokes on the wheels of the wagons. So in both of these works, we see man and nature contrasting, yet in harmony. The mountain is timeless and will always be there, but man has begun to master the surrounding landscape. It's interesting to realize that these artists were not only illustrating America's view of nature and wilderness, but they were helping to shape it. The mountains and the forests were becoming less daunting to the local residents. As land was cleared, farms thrived, and people eventually began to have more leisure time. The artists created scenes depicting images of men and women being comfortable in nature while enjoying and being inspired by the natural landscape around them. These bucolic views encouraged their audience that nature had a purpose beyond simply being used and exploited. This is William Preston Phelps' painting of Monadnock from West Keene. We'll hear much more about him shortly. These early artists served as some of the first marketers of the region. Despite the importance of Jackson's geological study, it wasn't widely read by the general public, but his lithograph was reproduced and sold far and wide. Mason's work appeared on the wall map, as we have seen, which also had a large audience. And the work of Scott and Fisher was also seen outside of the region. Numerous authors also focused on the mountain by the 1870s. Nathaniel Hawthorne, shown here, John Greenleaf Whittier, and others followed Thoreau and Emerson to the region. So they painted a visual image through their words, but now people began to see southwest New Hampshire's mountain in the paintings of the artists who were working here. Their works were the first advertisements, visual advertisements for the region and for the mountain. And the timing was ideal to draw visitors here. The first railroad came through in the 1840s, opened to Troy in 1847 and to Keene in 1848. So visitors from the Boston area could arrive here in 2.5 to 3 hours, and then they could take a carriage ride to the mountain or even walk there from Troy, as Thoreau and Emerson did. From here was an easy hike or carriage ride to the mountain, where they would commune with nature. This is a view of Troy with the mountain in the background. They climbed them to the summit to enjoy the unparalleled views. Farmers surrounding the mountain began to rent rooms and to serve meals to visitors as early as the 1840s. And as I mentioned, refreshment stands were opened on the mountain itself. A summer resort hotel, the Monadnock Mountain House, opened halfway up to the summit in the 1860s. It was later known as the Halfway House. Other artists followed these early painters, and by mid-century and the late 1800s, we had several of them appearing here. Jessie Talbot, Helen Knowlton, Rose Lamb, and Julia Dunn worked here between the 1860s and the 1880s, some of them probably staying at the Mountain House. What followed in the late 1800s was a more formal organization of artists who came, studied, and painted the region. And it really is essential to know the story of Abbot Thayer, Abbot Henderson Thayer, shown here, to understand the motivation of many of those artists who came after him, and to understand what later became known as the Dublin Art Colony. Thayer first came to Dublin in 1888. By that time, he was almost 40 years old. His mother was a native of Keene, one of the 7 beautiful Henderson sisters, as they were called. This is a photo of them later in life. Abbot Thayer was actually born in Boston because his father, a physician, was working there at the time. The family moved to Keene in 1856, however. Young Thayer began painting animals as a boy and chose painting as a profession by the time he was a teenager. He remained in Keene until he left during his high school years to further his education. That education included studying art and painting in Paris. In 1887, he was married and had 4 children with his wife, Kate. He was also building a reputation as an artist and an art teacher, offering classes to others. One of his students in the summer of 1887 was wealthy Dublin summer resident Mary Amory Green. She became an admirer of his talents and offered to build him a cottage at Dublin so he could be near the mountain. The following year, Thayer moved his family into this summer home that she had built for him. Thayer has been described as a needy genius and an Olympic-class eccentric. The first is illustrated by his art and teaching. The eccentric trait is well illustrated by his living arrangements in Dublin. Although the cottage was designed for summer habitation, Thayer eventually moved his family into the cottage year-round. The home didn't have running water, electricity, or central heating. He believed in the healing power of fresh air, and the entire family slept outdoors in lean-tos all year. This is a picture of his daughter wrapped up in a bearskin, sleeping outside in the winter. So the family household was chaotic, moody. And he was the moody, impetuous, and egotistical center of attention for the family. Among his numerous subjects was the mountain, which he could see from his home. He was a talented artist and captivating teacher. He wanted only to paint and teach, so Miss Green's offer to manage his business affairs was readily accepted. This is her home in Dublin. She arranged his classes and collected student fees. His father wrote, "This leaves his eyes and mind free for painting." Numerous patrons were willing to help him financially. Thayer's talent and his body of Monadnock work alone would make him an important figure in any history of the painters of the mountain, but his allure as a teacher, however, made him one of two central figures in our story tonight. He attracted many students and artists to Dublin who came to study at his side or to be near him. The view of the mountain standing tall over Dublin Lake, the character of the small village of Dublin, and the congregation of rich and famous summer residents were surely attractions, but Thayer himself was the true enticement for many of these young artists who came here to paint. They were often swept up in his passion for beauty and art, represented by the mountain hovering over their town. Thayer's Monadnocks often seem dark, with shade and shadows in the foreground. However, that draws our focus to the lighter, softer summit in the distance, as you can see here. This might be viewed as transcendentalist art, showing the connection between the natural world and the spiritual significance. And for Thayer, his art was, he said, dictation from God, and that dictation came through his mountain. He also did numerous impressionistic works of the mountain, in which he used light brush strokes and light colors, suggesting a softer, brighter, and more welcoming landscape. With the mountain truly serving as his muse, it's easy to understand why he became an early naturalist as well, and a conservationist. He wanted to save the mountain that meant so much to him in his work. During the first decade of the 20th century, Thayer became aware of a group of private citizens who were trying to purchase up the land near the top of the mountain. One of them placed a sign high up on the mountain that proclaimed, "No passing through." The sign deeply disturbed Thayer, who, along with many others, had felt that this land could be traveled freely, and they'd used it as common land for many years. Fearing the worst for the mountain's future, Thayer went to work to try to preserve it in its natural state. Preservation of land on the mountain had already begun, and Thayer went to work to do his part. He mapped many of the lots on the mountain and researched who he believed owned those, and many of them belonged to descendants of original proprietors of the town. With the assistance of the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests, they found 89 of those descendants and convinced them to sign over their rights in the property to the Forest Society. Adding to this, through quitclaim deeds and purchase from abutting property owners, much of the mountain, including the summit, was preserved forever. Thayer had helped to accomplish what he had dreamed of when he began his crusade. He had written to the private owners who were trying to buy land and block the passage of others traveling through, and he said, "Were that mountainside in my keeping, as it is in yours, I should feel that my only rights were to see that no deterioration of its virginity occurred." Artist and Thayer student Barry Faulkner summed up his teacher's life, art, and conservationism as follows: Thayer shaped his life and his family on Emerson, Audubon, and Monadnock. Monadnock was their totem, their fetish, the object of their adoration. They surrounded themselves to the sorcery of its primitive being. Thayer fought successfully to defend his mountain against commercial vandals, and through his efforts, much of Monadnock is now a state preserve, as Barry Faulkner said. Abbot Henderson Thayer illustrated through his art the natural beauty of Monadnock that was worthy of preservation. Through his research and legal work and leadership, he helped to ensure that preservation became reality. Before we move on to the constellation of artists that circled around Abbot Thayer, we must explore the second central figure in the story of Monadnock painters. William Preston Phelps was a contemporary of Thayer. He was born 1 year before Thayer. He passed away 2 years after. But both of their professional careers centered on the mountain. Their art was quite different, however. Despite the fact that they lived and worked a few miles apart, we don't know that they ever worked together professionally. We don't know that they were friends. We don't know much about their connection, if there was one. William Preston Phelps was born in the village of Pottersville, now Chesham, New Hampshire, in 1848, in the 18th century farmhouse that had been purchased by his parents, Jason and Mary, just 2 years earlier. He grew up there on the farm, attended the local district school number 10, and briefly attended a private high school in the neighborhood. Phelps became interested in drawing as a boy. His grandnephew wrote the following interesting story about Phelps as a youngster. From my grandfather's stories and those of my cousins, all agreed that Uncle Preston, as our family called him, was something of an art prodigy as a boy. Grandpa Phelps told us that his brother could draw anything he saw with a pencil. When I was 12 years old, Grandpa told me this story about his brother. He drew a picture of the family house and the fence out front and proudly showed it to his uncle, who was a carpenter. Not wanting to hurt the boy's feelings, he took his time, but finally came out with it. Willie, this is a nice-looking drawing you've done, but you've drawed that farther fence post shorter than the first one. Well, that's the way I saw it, Uncle, the boy asserted. Well, his uncle went on, you know the furthest post is just as tall as the one nearby. You have to draw things the way they be, boy, and not let your imagination run away with you. Well, Phelps took the criticism well, even though it wasn't entirely accurate because of his perspective of the scene. But the realism of his later work showed that he didn't let his imagination run away with him. Jason Phelps realized that his son had some talent. And when the younger Phelps was a teenager, his father sent him to Lowell, Massachusetts to learn the trade of sign painting and decorating. By the age of 21, he had his own paint shop, and he started traveling into Boston to study drawing and to attend art classes. He married Anna Maria Kittredge of Lowell in 1868. Their first son, Arthur, lived less than 1 year, but children Ina and Edward followed over the next few years. This is a photo of their daughter and the family dog, and then beside it a painting that he did of them. By the early 1870s, Phelps was displaying some of his paintings in the window of his shop in Lowell. They sold well and attracted the attention of several Lowell businessmen. They wanted to introduce more culture into the growing city of Lowell, so they decided to send him to Europe and finance his studies with the masters of the day. This is a portrait of him that was done while he was studying in Europe. In 1875, he studied in Munich under leading artists and teachers of the day before returning to Lowell in 1876. After selling several paintings, like this one that he did in Europe, Phelps and his family returned to Europe, and he continued his studies in Munich and in Paris. Their last child was born there in 1879. The family returned to Lowell. In 1881, he opened a studio there and became a full-time professional artist. He often traveled and painted in the summer, either along the New England coast or way out in the west, in locales such as California, New Mexico, and Colorado. And in 1886, he painted this 7 by 12 foot canvas of the Grand Canyon, which became quite famous. It was displayed in different places, including at the rim of the canyon, and visitors paid to see it. Unfortunately, we don't have any color images of it, and you'll hear why shortly, because it disappeared later on. Despite his extensive travel and talent and growing experience, Phelps was still searching for the one subject through which he could really express his deepest emotions on canvas. He always made an annual visit out to the family home in Chesham. On one such visit, he was standing on the porch of his parents' old farmstead, looking out over the fields in the distance. Far across the valley stood Mount Monadnock. At that moment, according to author Charles Hurd, Phelps realized that the mountain and the surrounding countryside of his boyhood would be his life's work. Phelps's father died in 1889. He acquired the family homestead and moved back to Chesham. He dedicated himself to painting the Monadnock region, and especially the mountain. Within a few years, he became known as the painter of Monadnock, and is still known as that. He was not really a member of the Dublin art colony, but his subject was the same as many of them, the mountain. Phelps must have done hundreds of paintings of the mountain. Not only did he paint it in every season and from every angle, but he seems to have been intrigued with light. He seldom painted it in full sunlight, but did the mountain and the region under gray skies, black skies, and shadow, and even by moonlight. He was a wonderful painter of snow as well, helping the viewer to feel as if they were there with him on a snowy day. One reason he could accomplish all of this was because of his portable studio that he moved around the region, described by one of his descendants as follows. The four sides and roof could be loaded on a cart or sled in winter and horse-drawn to any location that the artist wished to paint a picture in field or forest. Equipped with oil stove, the seasons mattered not, nor rain nor snow. There was a cot and blankets, a small table, easel and chair, hampers of food and spirits that landscape painters seemed to deem necessary. With paint and canvas, he was then lord of his castle and domain. He could stay and finish a big canvas of the mountain, a forest, creek, or a tumbling brook, according to his descendant. In addition to the mountain, Phelps is known for his paintings of barnyard animals, especially at the Phelps homestead, which was built in 1762, or at other farms along Brown Road, where his house was located. Phelps built a 40 by 24-foot studio across the road from his home in Chesham, where he worked and displayed his paintings. Had a large stone fireplace and chimney. This is him sitting beside the fireplace. For 27 years, he painted the region. His wife, Anna, died in 1901, and during his later years, according to his relatives, Phelps frequented the Dublin Hotel bar. He suffered a stroke in 1917 that ended his painting career, and his mental and physical health deteriorated. Sold, broken up. The studio burned a few decades later, and the home on Brown Road was extensively remodeled. However, because of his extensive body of work focusing on the mountain, much of which still survives, he is still known as the painter of Monadnock. His work focused on the mountain and the everyday life surrounding it. As I mentioned, he painted Monadnock in all seasons and from all viewpoints. He also focused on the fields and forests of his home region near the base of the mountain. He was clearly a practitioner of the realism style of painting. His work shows accurate, unembellished, and detailed depictions of nature. Earlier I mentioned the numerous other artists who were drawn to Dublin, to the mountain, and to Abbot Thayer by the classes and the personality of Thayer himself. This group was so numerous and so influential in the art world that, taken as a whole, they were later dubbed the Dublin Art Colony. George DeForest Brush met Thayer in New York when he was a young man, and they crossed paths once again in Paris when they were both students there in the 1870s. The two developed a friendship, and Brush came to Dublin in 1898 after a road trip. Thayer encouraged him to bring his family to the summer there in Dublin that year, and soon they settled there permanently. In the 1880s, Brush had spent time in the West painting Native Americans, for which he received considerable recognition and which instilled in him a lifelong compassion and sympathy for them. In the years after he settled with his family in Dublin, he worked mostly on portraits. He rarely painted the mountain itself, but he did include it in some of his portraits. You can see Monadnock Rising behind the mother and child in this painting. This is a brush painting of the mountain. Thayer student and cousin Barry Faulkner was born in Keene in 1881. He grew up in the city and became one of the foremost mural artists of his generation. That's a picture of him feeding sheep out in Chesham. During the summer of his 16th birthday, Faulkner bicycled between his parents' cottage at Silver Lake in Harrisville and over to Abbot Thayer's home in Dublin to study painting. Thayer was the first in a long list of artists Barry studied with and taught throughout his career. This is a photo of Barry and Thayer's son Gerald. That fall, Barry went to Phillips Exeter Academy. He wanted to attend art school, but his father, who was an attorney, Francis Faulkner of Keene, he wanted Barry to go to Harvard, as he had done. So they talked about it and argued a bit, and finally they came up with an agreement that if Barry attended Harvard for 1 year and didn't wish to continue, he could then go on to art school. Barry entered Harvard in September of 1899, kept his agreement with his father. At the end of the year, he said, "I want to study art," and he went off to try to become a mural painter. He studied and traveled in Florence with Dublin's George DeForest Brush. At Cornish, New Hampshire, he worked in the studio of Augustus St. Gaudens, America's leading sculptor. In New York, he studied at the Art Students League, and in 1907, Barry Faulkner won the Rome Prize Fellowship to the American Academy in Rome to study ancient art and architecture, which he did. When he returned to New York in 1910, after studying there, he completed a mural for a New York home and then made his entire career mural painting after that. He did paint other works, but professionally, he earned most of his money on his murals. His most famous murals are the two murals at the National Archive, the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence, and the mosaic Intelligence Awakening Mankind, which is in New York City. It's a 75-foot-long mosaic at the RCA building in Rockefeller Center. Check it out if you go and visit. It's very interesting. It's right on the entryway. And if you ever watch 30 Rock, in the intro to the show, they show the mural as they pan up the building. The 3 Oregon murals that he did on the history of the state for the state capitol in Salem, and 4 historical murals for the Senate chamber in the New Hampshire state capitol in Concord. There are several murals and studies still available for viewing in Keene, including Central Square, Keene, which is in Elliott Hall at Keene State College, the advent of the railroad in 1848, which is at the Historical Society, the study for Intelligence Awakening Mankind, which is at the Historical Society, so he went through a long process to come up with these final murals. The Keene Public Library is home to studies for the New Hampshire Senate Chamber murals, and most important for this topic, his Men of Monadnock murals, which are in the Bank of America on Central Square in Keene. He clearly focused on public art that is very realistic, usually with a historic theme. The Men of Monadnock, in this image, he pays homage to the mountain and to Emerson, Thoreau on the right, and Thayer in the middle. He loved the mural making process. He would first negotiate the subject and the commission, and then he researched the subject, sometimes for a year or two. These were mostly historic scenes, and he wanted to be sure they were accurate. So he researched the subjects, the people, the places, the time period, that would be depicted in the mural, and then created numerous drawings and studies that would be incorporated into the design of the final mural. The final black and white study was done, and an oil study was also done to get the colors, which were then used to enlarge the image onto the large mural canvas. The painting of the final mural might take months to complete before it was affixed to the wall. Advent of the Railroad, now on display at the Historical Society in Keene, was his last mural, painted in 1874. Painted when he was 74. He passed away in 1966. Frank Weston Benson spent several summers in Dublin, working with Thayer in the late 1880s and the 1890s. While there, he focused mainly on idealized women paintings of idealized women, but he also painted the mountain occasionally and Dublin Lake. He then moved to the New Hampshire coast and painted there and on the coast of Maine. He changed his focus really from women and children to animals and marine scenes. In the 1890s, he became interested in the Impressionist movement and eventually became one of America's leading Impressionists. He passed away in 1951, and one of his paintings sold at Sotheby's in 1995 for $4.1 million. Rockwell Kent began his formal art education at the Art Students League in 1900. He apprenticed with Abbott Thayer during the summers of 1903 and 1904, when he was in his early 20s. Several of his Monadnock and New Hampshire paintings were displayed in New York City in 1904. One of these is one of his best-known paintings, titled Dublin Pond, which was purchased there in New York at that time by Smith College, and it is at the Smith College Museum of Art. He never moved to Dublin, but he was good friends with Thayer, and he visited often. He was also inspired by the stark beauty of wilderness, and he traveled and painted in Alaska and in Iceland, among other places. He was also a well-known illustrator for books. He illustrated a well-known edition of Moby Dick, for example. But he was also a socialist, and he was outraged by the way he was treated during the McCarthy investigation, so he donated most of his art, as he said, to the people of the Soviet Union, where it is housed in the Hermitage Museum today. Richard Merriman was a native of Chelsea, Massachusetts. That's him looking in our direction there. He studied under Frank Weston Benson and Edmund Tarbell at the Boston Museum School of Fine Art before coming to Dublin to work as a copyist for Abbott Thayer at the age of 25. Thayer, as you know, was temperamental and feared that he would ruin his own work by making too many changes, or that he might lose his talent overnight. So every day he had these two copyists copy his work. The first summer that Merriman was there, he lived in an abandoned caddy shack at a 4-hole golf course in the town. He copied Thayer's work in the morning, and then he worked on his own paintings in the afternoon. He remained closely tied to Dublin after his first summer there. He bought a house in 1924 at auction for back taxes and moved his family in permanently in 1935. He's best known also for his portraits, many of them of Dublin residents, but as you can see, his impressionistic Monadnock paintings are wonderfully light and inviting. He set up his easel on the ice at Dublin Lake to create this large landscape, and it is very large. It's about 5 feet long. Our next artist, Alexander James, also studied at the Boston Museum School under Frank Benson and worked with Abbott Thayer. In 1910, he came to Dublin to study under Thayer. He's best known for his portraits, but he also did landscapes, including the mountain. He married a fellow art student, Frederica Payne, and they moved to Santa Barbara, California, where he worked on portrait commissions. But he really longed for Dublin. They returned to New England in 1919. They purchased an old home there and made it their home. The family lived in Dublin, and he focused on portraiture, but this piece he did do of Monadnock. But it was really Richmond, New Hampshire, where the folks were plain and down to earth, that he enjoyed being the most. It really fired his imagination for art. He painted the people there and bonded with them and worked with them. He took up residence in Richmond by himself in an abandoned farmhouse that he purchased. And this is an Albert Quigley painting of the farmhouse. His wife and children came out on the weekend to visit. Faulkner described it in this way. On Friday nights, when school was over, his wife and boys would take the long, rough ride to Richmond to be welcomed by the big dogs, fires of 4-foot logs, and Alec's contagious gaiety. So Richmond was really his heart and his home. He did return to Dublin later in life and built this studio behind his home there. He passed away in February of 1946, and the town really closed down for his funeral, and there were so many people that many of them had to stand outside the church in the snow during the service. James also attracted students to Dublin, just as Thayer had done. One of them was Guri Ivanov Rinov. This is a photo of him and James in the background. He was born in Russia in 1902. He attended a military academy. He was fighting the communists by age 15. His family escaped Russia for China in 1920. He made his way to America, won a scholarship at the Museum School of Fine Arts in Boston. It was there that he met James, who brought him to Dublin. James gave him a piece of land, and Ivanov Rinov built a home there in Dublin and made Dublin his home base for the rest of his life. He painted many subjects in a variety of styles, and probably is best known for his works that really use stylized subjects like many of the WPA art pieces. This piece is a good example. He has incorporated a Harrisville mill in the foreground, a Swansea-covered bridge there, and Mount Monadnock, all in the same scene, all blended together. Lila Cabot was born in Boston in 1848. She married a linguist, Thomas Perry, in 1874, and as far as we know, she completed her first artwork 3 years later, and then began formal art training. She and her family moved to Paris in 1887, where she became friends with Mary Cassatt, Camille Pissarro, and her mentor, Claude Monet. She went on to become a well-known American impressionist, inspired by the style of Monet. She had a summer home in Hancock that looked out toward the mountain. Her monadnocks clearly show the impressionist influence. This work is entitled Marie at the Window, with monadnock in the background. She and her husband are buried in Hancock. Another local artist who had a strong connection to the Dublin colony was Nelson's Albert Quigley. He was an important painter of monadnock, and I'll outline his contribution. He lived in Nelson Village. He was a friend of Alexander James of the Dublin colony. Their homes were a few short miles apart, but their lives were very, very different. James lived among Dublin's privileged crowd, and Quig, as he was known, worked constantly and struggled to support his family. It was their art and Quigley's talented frame making that brought them together. Quigley made many frames for James. He was a native of Maine, as was Quig. He was painting before he was drafted into the military in World War I. He remained in France for a time after the war ended to study painting. He arrived in Keene in 1920 at the encouragement of friends from the service. He resumed his painting, married, met some of the Dublin artists, including Alec James, and then in 1934 his family settled into a small house in Nelson on the town common. It is the dark house here on the left. He remained there in the village the rest of his life. He worked various jobs. He worked in the Harrisville mills. He made frames. He played with local dance bands. He repaired fiddles and often bartered his art for goods and services for his family. He would trade it at the village store in Harrisville. He traded with the doctor to get care. He would go to the dentist and trade paintings for his work on his children's teeth, so he bartered many of his works. Despite his hard work and frugal lifestyle, he always found time for painting. He painted New England scenes of his village and all around the region. This is a view in Sullivan. He also painted portraits of family and friends and acquaintances, mostly from the Nelson area, and the viewer can really learn a good deal about the subjects from the expressions on the faces of the subjects themselves and their features. Like many artists in the area, he often turned his view toward Mount Monadnock. They have really sort of earthy tones to them. Sometimes impressionistic, other times more realistic. They always showed the landscape as it truly appeared. Despite his financial struggles, Albert Quigley maintained a passion for life that is exhibited in his art that he left behind. Essayist Lance Tucker wrote of Quig that his life was measured in accomplishments, raw talent, and perseverance. He died in 1961 and was buried in the Old Nelson Cemetery just up the hill from his home. So he really represents a period of transition from the often formal work of the members of the Dublin Art Colony to today's artists who paint the mountain. Many local and visiting painters have turned to Monadnock for inspiration for their brushstrokes over the past 6 decades as well. One of those from away who came and focused on our mountain landscape was William Alden Brown, born in 1877. He lived and worked in Rhode Island, but he came up here to paint. And this is a view of Perkins Pond from the mountain, a perspective different than one we usually see. Others included Frederick Rhodes Sisson, Robert Emmett Owen of Massachusetts, and Henry Webster Rice, who lived in Massachusetts and Maine. He's known for his town landscapes and his coastal scenes, but he did at least 2 Monadnocks, including this one from the collections of the Historical Society. Artist Charles Curtis Allen lived in Massachusetts and Vermont. He was known as an impressionist mountain painter and painted coastal scenes as well. He created a number of Monadnocks. Those who have lived most of their lives here and painted the mountain include Art Tremblay and Bob Collier, shown here, both of whom had other long careers before focusing full-time on their art. A local resident who has devoted his entire professional life to art is Richard Whitney. This is his Monadnock Spring Buds. This is another mountain by Richard, entitled Orchard at Woodbine Farm. Current painters who paint for themselves and for their customers include Linda DeSaint, Mary Islin, who probably many of you know, shown here working on a Monadnock, Alicia Draciotes, David Dodge, this is one of his many works, Howard Hill, and many others. One artist who is becoming locally known right now and has focused on the mountain is Gary Custer. This is a small piece that he did. Over the last 180 years, Mount Monadnock has been the subject of untold numbers of paintings. The number of artists was small at first, and their works were not widely known for a few years. People such as Jackson, Mason, and Dolbear, who did those first 3 pieces. They were soon followed by Allen and Scott, who were already known for their White Mountain pieces. This is a piece by Henry DeMeritt Young. As we have seen, all of these artists taken together began to spread the image of our mountain to a much wider audience. They are rightly viewed as some of the first individuals to promote and advertise southwest New Hampshire, sharing the beauty and tranquility of the region across New England and then beyond. This is Richard Whitney's Harvest Moon. We have seen that they were illustrating America's changing view of the wilderness, while at the same time helping to shape that image through their artwork. Here is a work by current artist Eric Koppel, which really has dramatized the landscape of the mountain. The 2 artists most closely associated with the mountain were Abbott Thayer and William Preston Phelps. They lived at the base of the landmark, painted its prospect many times, and helped to conserve the land on the mountain, as we have seen, and drew numerous other artists to the region, many of whom stayed and became famous in their own right, and eventually became known as the Dublin Art Colony. Phelps made painting the mountain and the local neighborhood the focus of his entire career. He became closely associated with the mountain and is still known as the painter of Monadnock. These were simply the best known of the artists who looked to the mountain to stimulate their imagination and their talent. We don't know that any of the summer hotels had artists in residence, as several of the White Mountain hotels did, but this is the Leffingwell, one of the large summer resort hotels, and you can see the lake behind it in the distance and the mountain rising behind it as well. For many, there was much more to the decision to focus on the mountain and the best-known peak in southern New Hampshire. They felt a personal and, for some, spiritual connection with the rocky summit that rose above the surrounding hills and the small New Hampshire villages. This is a painting by Jesse Talbot. Monadnock truly was their muse, their source of inspiration, and their creativity. This is a Richard Merriman view. Hundreds of artists have painted thousands of canvases of the region's most famous natural feature over the past century and a half. Probably there are 100 doing so today, and many more will in the future. As Monadnock has been designated a national natural landmark by the federal government and will be preserved and available into the distant future in its natural state. We have just seen a Mary Islin painting, and this is another Merriman. These artists have helped to create the image of the Monadnock region as we and those from outside the area know it today, the Currier and Ives Corner of New Hampshire, a place that's known for its heritage, history, and well-preserved historical New England villages. and its natural landscape. So we will always remain thankful to the region's artists and those who helped to conserve the space here, including several thousand acres on Monadnock. This is another Phelps. They illustrated and encouraged that preservation and way of life. We owe them a profound vote of thanks. The last three paintings actually were by William Preston Phelps. I want to conclude by saying that this was a much bigger topic than I imagined it would be when I agreed to prepare this presentation for a class a few months ago. However, I found numerous sources on Monadnock art and the individual artists, and I've just finished preparing a bibliography of the sources I used. If anyone is interested in that, I'll be glad to share it. And one source that was very helpful was the Friends of the Dublin Art Colony website, and especially the essays of Edie Clark, who many of us are familiar with. This is another version of Richard Whitney's Spring Buds. And one thing that really surprised me as I was doing this is that many of these artists have been well researched and written about and recorded, and William Preston Phelps, our painter of Monadnock, has not been. So maybe somebody should do a book on that subject. And I also think the Historical Society of Cheshire County should do an exhibit on this subject. Are there any questions or comments? Anything you would like me to cover?
Alan?
Rob?
Because you have a marvelous Phelps on display at the Historical Society, and you didn't...
I didn't include that, you're right.
But
I should have, considering where I was speaking.
some of you here will remember that used to be hanging in the bank.
In the bank here in Jaffrey.
And there were efforts some years ago that resulted in it going to Keene.
That's right.
Well preserved. there.
When the bank was sold, they wanted the painting to be preserved locally.
Who's the they?
Excuse me?
Who is the they?
The,
who wanted
the,
to move?
the administration, the trustees of the bank at that time, when they sold out, wanted to preserve a few pieces, including that in advent of the railroad mural that Barry Faulkner did. They also donated that to the Historical Society. Other questions or comments?
Do we have any
Online
questions
questions?
coming online? No, we don't, on the chat? Okay. Anybody else? That was
Thank you very much.
fabulous. So thank you very much, Alan, for the perspectives and the styles, and over time, we see so many different ways to view our mountain
Right.
here.
Exactly.
It's really captured it so beautifully. Thank you
Thank you very
for
much.
sharing it. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you in October. If not before.
Is that it?